What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm a game designer on the Summoner's Rift team. We are the team largely responsible for the updates you see every couple of weeks in League of Legends. And here to talk about the fact that patch 13.19 has just been locked today. And so I'm here to talk about what we are shipping into the patch. This is the patch the World Championship is going to be played on. I'll also give you some context into what else we're working on behind the scenes that is coming soon. Not much else to say, except that it's going to be the patch of Worlds. I'm excited. I think the Worlds meta is going to be quite good. There's only really one thing I'm super worried about. Hopefully it all works out in the end. But anyway, I think it's going to be very, very fun. Looking forward to watching it. Before we get into the patch itself, let's do a quick... I did this last time. It was actually pretty successful. What's coming soon and an update on pro balance going forward. So there are several longer-term projects the live pod has been working on that... Some of which, to be fair, would have been ready for patch 13.19. I don't think they would have been ready for 0.18. Regardless, there are three fairly large projects that we've been working on that the two that I was working on, which were Cassante and Jungle update, I just merged into the release branch today, and so that'll hit PBE when PBE updates with 0.20, and we'll talk about that when it happens. We're also doing an anti-snowballing update that will also come out that patch. I think that'll get merged maybe tomorrow or something, but we intend to have several large sets of changes in 13.20 unless things change. We have to pivot. I don't think we will, but to be determined. We did some very minor, brief pre-planning on the next large updates we're going to work on that we'll probably have to wait for January or something. We'll see. But ultimately, I know it's been several patches of relatively light, lower risk changes. I can't guarantee that every 3 patches can have a big systems update or something, but I don't know. I find it kind of strange the amount of like fridge gif style posts I've seen on the subreddit. Like, I don't know what level of change people are really hungry for. Also, the types of people who are on Twitter and Reddit are the ultra extremely engaged 1% of League of Legends players who probably have much more appetite for change than your average League of Legends player. So I don't know. I don't know how to parse all of this, just to say that the echo chamber you tend to see in like, hey, you're here looking at the YouTube channel of a game designer on League of Legends. You are not the average League of Legends player. Neither am I. And if you go on to discuss this kind of stuff on the League of Legends subreddit or on Twitter or something, guess what? You're also still not the average League of Legends player. So there's a lot to unpack there. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I just want to really reiterate that, like, anywhere you go to talk about League of Legends, you are by definition in an echo chamber because you're with people going to the same place as you. You are not, yeah, so just that in general, but there are some longer term projects that are hitting the game relatively soon that, again, some of which wouldn't have been ready anyway, some of which we did hold back with the expectation that we would launch them after Worlds. Regardless, still going to be pretty cool. The second thing is a update sort of on the thoughts on pro balance. We don't have any hard and fast rules here by any means, but the idea is that we're going to do less pro-focused balancing going forward. We are still going to spend time on the Mid-Season Invitational and Worlds. I think it's important that we, for a little bit out of the year, spend time saying, okay, we're going to hyper-focus or at least moderately focus on pro play for a short time because there is a very large tournament that even if you are not a pro player, which is 99.999% of you, an extremely large portion of players watch pro play. So even in terms of like, let's serve as many players as possible, it is just correct to focus on pro play at some points in time over the year because a significant number of League of Legends players watch large-scale tournaments, and having the tournament metagame be exciting is a positive for League of Legends players on average. So we will never do no pro balancing. And in fact, we will probably do a certain amount of identifying that, let's say a champion like Jinx is really pro bound. This is the kind of thing where we would to be fair, this is not like necessarily the entire opinion of the entire design team, but I will share you my opinion on this one, which is like a champion like Jinx should probably look more like Garen than a Zir, where, right, this champion probably shouldn't be 47% win rate in gold solo queue and trapped by pro pick ban Meanwhile, you have Garen, who is very successful in lower MMRs and isn't seen in pro. That is the kind of shape that many champions should probably have. And if we see a champion like Jinx, who I'm pick an example of a champion that I believe should have more of a Garen curve than an Azir curve. Hey, maybe we'll make updates to ensure that Jinx is always viable for the vast majority of players in solo queue, and we could like unpro skew her, this kind of thing. So a random thing, just sort of, again, not entirely fully formed thoughts, but the kind of thing I want to deliver here as, hey, we will probably do less pro patch by patch balance going forward. Obviously, there's no pro play to speak of for the rest of the year for us, so that's going to be entirely irrelevant for us. But anyway, wanted to give those updates. Let's talk about the content of the patch itself now. So I actually think we should be doing this more often, but starting with system changes because they affect the game at a whole. As a at a more grand level, but a 10% gold buff to Randuin's Omen I think is a fairly big deal. I mentioned earlier in the intro that there's only really a couple outliers I may be worried about here for Worlds, one of which is Tristana mid lane. We changed her in 13.16 to weaken her in magic damage matchups, lowering both her base MR and her base health, giving it to her back in terms of armor and armor growth. This was meant to be relatively power neutral for bottom lane, but clearly much weaker against burst mages, which often do exist in the mid lane. So the hope there was that that change would meaningfully impact her pro presence. Of course, that change came in 13.16, and no leagues around the world played on the patch, and so it didn't have anything to provide there. We don't have a way of measuring the full impact of those changes other than measuring solo queue win rates, which is not very helpful because solo queue has a lot of attack damage mid laners like Zed, Yasuo, and Yone. Tristana's mid lane win rate actually went up because of course it would. The most common mid laners in solo queue are physical damage, so that doesn't give us much to go off of. But again, less health, less Amar. That's the hope. But secondarily, I shipped the change around his Omen. I also shipped the change to Seeker's Armguard here. These are the two system changes this patch. Essentially, it was identifying that, okay, well, even if Tristana is still too good, there should probably be a strong systemic release valve on double crit marksman compositions. Like maybe Tristana is only good or only great if you play in, AP bot laner like, Hybrid or AP Kai'Sa, or you actually go and play Ziggs. And I feel like if you're playing Tristana Ziggs, you're actually playing a real comp, and in the sense that like, you still have one marksman, one mage. This all feels very reasonable, right? That's the kind of thing where it's just, you built a clever team composition. Good for you. Congratulations. You did some cool things. You did some smart things. Whereas like if you're just allowed to play, Tristana Zary and there's no obvious baseline counter, it means that the types of systems that should be good against multiple marksmen aren't good enough. And so Randuin's Omen being a strong item to say you can pick Ornn or Scion or something and you can just tank their enemy team comp and wear them down because they can't kill your frontline fast enough, that's great. And it's why I really like that Randuin's Omen has a very, very sharp, unique passive. Randuin's Omen, I believe, actually I know this is true, Randuin's Omen is not the best generic armor item. Its gold efficiency after this change will be very similar to the baseline health versus armor versus ability haste versus gold efficiency of other armor items. Then what Randuin's gives you is some anti-auto attack stuff, right? Anti-damage on auto, anti-damage when you're crit, and then like a fairly mediocre active slow that does something. It's like, so there, there's a couple of mechanics there. You could argue maybe there's one too many, but regardless, this item has a niche and you are paying for the unique passive that gives you anti-crit damage. And then there's other items that can be more effective in other situations. You have items like Frozen Heart, where actually I do want mana on my champion. I'm going to buy Frozen Heart because it makes sense. Also, it's actually good against a champion like Irelia, where she cares about the attack speed and not the crit damage reduction. And so you have a very obvious choice there. And items like Thornmail, where again, the gold efficiency very similar to Randuin's Omen, but what it provides you is grievous wounds and damage return because of the types of champions you're going to be facing against. And so these items being unique in terms of their actual niche means that we shouldn't be in a you default to Randuin's Omen metagame. And so this shouldn't just generically hate on every crit marksman, but it does mean if you're going to play a bunch of Yasuo in the mid lane, well, guess what? If you're Yasuo in the mid lane and your bot laner is crit Caitlyn, Randuin is going to show up, and there are systemic counters to your team stacking too much crit chance. I think it's very wise for this item to be viable. I think it's currently quite bad, and so a relatively large buff. This is the kind of thing that, we should absolutely see Randuin's purchased with this kind of thing going on. It is unfortunate this change has come in so late. I would have liked to get this in sooner, but I didn't identify this as a good target earlier. But this is the kind of thing where like this could have been buffed a very, very long time ago. I will say that I personally can only look at so much of the game at a time, but this is the kind of change that obviously is very, very easy. The entire implementation of this change takes 2 minutes to, scroll over to the item and edit the number and then submit the file. It's not that hard, but I can't identify every single outlier in the game at all times. And so, hey, we did buff Randuin's earlier on in the year. We're just buffing it again because it's still below the line. Seeker's Arm Guard, in a sort of similar boat to, hey, if we're worried about Tristana being a problem systemically, there's always the, buff the champion Tristana is against by saying you can build an, AP armor item against her. In general, though, I think also this item, much like Randuin's, is simply weak. I think the way we should think about intermediary epic items, and I guess I want to be sort of clear about how I phrase this. So on the one hand, you have intermediary epic items. This is things like Kindle Gem and Caulfield's Warhammer and Winged Moonplate or Noon Quiver. I'm going to keep listing these items where it's like, the entire point of the item is to be completed. You don't sit on this item for any given reason. It's just a good, stopping point where it's a valuable recall target, and it also allows you to be a little more granular than if you have to always back for a BF sword. I don't think those items need to be particularly good. I think it's important that those items are not bad. In the 13.10 update, I specifically went through and tried to retune a lot of the intermediary epic items. This is, Sword, Dagger, but not Noon Quiver. Hearthbound Axe. This was buffing Hearthbound Axe because it was inefficient. This was slightly buffing a Recurve Bow because it was inefficient. This was nerfing Zeal because it was too efficient overall. And just like, hey, a Kerchai Shard also is an item that was like really, really bad. And so I upped the efficiency of that item as well. And it's like, okay, these components shouldn't be traps to buy, but they don't need to be exciting or strong to buy because they're only stepping stones anyway. If you want to give a power spike, you can. I mean, Noon Quiver is clearly an overpowered component, but they don't have to be. On the other side are what I'm going to make up a name here. I'm going to call them terminal epics, where it's an item you're going to buy and feel good about stopping here. So this is an item like Bramble Vest. This is Arm Guard. This is Hex Drinker. This is Quicksilver Sash, where you buy it because of the epic item. Oblivion Orb, Executioner's Calling, similar things here. Where it's like, you buy it for this given reason, right? And then at some point you can choose to finish it because it's gold efficient or slot efficient to do so, but you can also just stop on the component itself. I think it is totally reasonable to have these sort of terminal epics be good. Not necessarily overpowered. Like, I don't want every single AD versus AP matchup to always have Hex Drinker versus Arm Guard. But in my opinion, where we are right now is Hex Drinker is good, and if you are starting to lose to the mage in the mid lane, you can go buy a Hex Drinker and feel good about it. And meanwhile, Arm Guard is bad. It's probably just never worth actually buying this item because it's just too far below the line. That is my opinion. And when I suggested that we buff it, I was met with unanimous approval, and so we're buffing Arm Guard. Again, the kind of thing where I wish we identified this sooner. I would have been willing to buff this item much sooner, but my current manner of thinking on this system is that an item like Arm Guard and Hex Drinker are meant to be good, not ubiquitous, but that you can feel good about buying this, that you are delaying your efficient purchases later on down the line, your mythics, your legendaries, whatever, but in the meantime, you need to stop dying to Zed, and so you buy this item and you feel good about it. These are the two big system changes. Obviously, they are large buffs to the armor system at large, sure, but they are buffs to the armor system in specific cases where you opt into this because of your lane matchup or because of the enemy team composition, which is good. I think items are the best system for situational decision making, where you go back to base, you're going to wait in base for 10 seconds because you need to see, all right, let me take stock of the game. My health bar is refilling, my mana bar is refilling. I'm going to go to the shop. What is worth purchasing right now? You know what? They've got your crit marksman. I'm going to rain with this game. I think that is a shape that is very, very good. I think this makes sense. I think it makes much more sense than, say, the rune system. It can make some sense in champ select. There's a very long discussion to be had there. I'm not going to get into, but I think these make a lot of sense. I think reactive purchases are good for the game. They don't have to be popular. They just have to be good enough to be worth buying in the right situations. And I think the tuning choices here land that for both these systems. So then we're going into a suite of champion nerfs, and by and large, these are nerfs that are driven by pro play. As I mentioned, even if we are going to do fewer balance changes going forward aimed at pro play, for something like Worlds and something like MSI, we are going to do this because so many League of Legends players watch pro play that it is important that we actually do this. So up first is a nerf to Azir, and it's very light. We made a systems update to Azir in the previous patch by nerfing Crown of the Shattered Queen in cases where your enemies are tightly coordinated. Crown's overall power level seems to be quite neutral for solo queue. Though, yes, the max AP of Poise was 40. That was only at level 18, and most champs don't reach level 18. Also, Poise could have been knocked off, and so it could have been 0 for a large portion of the time. It's just a flat 15 ability power, and meanwhile, instead of really, really sharp DR for 1.5, it's a moderate amount of DR for 2.5. Overall power level seems to be very close on this item. Maybe we buff Crown a little bit. We could do so. I don't think it's terribly pressing. I think the item is viable. Regardless, I think it was nerfed in the case of it sharply countering coordinated enemy teams. This was an item that Azir sharply purchased, had about a 75% pick rate in recent patches in pro play, which is 1.5x its pick rate in solo queue. Probably, a solid change here. But in an abundance of caution, we think we've done enough to nerf Tristana, enough to nerf the systemic, or change the systemic things that can make Tristana good or make her uncounterable. We're saying, Azir is pretty likely to be the number 1 mid laner. We're going to do a very, very light tap to Azir. I'm going to reiterate what I said in the video on Monday, which is that I forget if it was in the video or if it was in like Reddit comments or Twitter comments or something, but essentially what it boils down to is when talking about pro play, on the one hand, you have champions like Azir, where they, and the update that we gave him earlier on in the year was very successful at making him a much more approachable and successful champion for players at home, and less of a pro-only champion. So it was successful directionally in getting us some gains there, which was very good. But Azir is still a champion that is ceilinged. His power level is ceilinged by pro play. I think Azir is a champion where that is actually totally fine and on theme, in the sense that Azir pretty well telegraphs that he is hard to play, that he is unique, that he is a high skill cap, relatively high agency, pretty big mindshare champion. I think Azir is like this. I think Aphelios is like this. I think Cassante is like this. I think there are several champions, even Lee Sin, somewhat like this, where it's like, if these champions aren't in pro play, they aren't good almost anywhere, unless you're a really, really hardcore main. And in general, I don't believe a champion should only be good in the hands of really hardcore mains. I believe in general, again, broad strokes here, that if you have hardcore mained a champion, you deserve to have an above 50% win rate. That if you've dedicated your time, you deserve to win more games than other players, because most players don't hardcore main their champions. And so you should be rewarded for champion mastery. I don't think that is a necessarily unpopular opinion. There is certainly a discussion to be had around the degree to which you should be rewarded. That is a very valid discussion, and the tuning there is very, very important, to be clear. You can't just be like, carte blanche, mastery matters, XD, you can't nerf my thing. But the general point should absolutely still hold true. This is to say that if a champion has like 5% pro presence and players observe a 48% solo queue win rate, this means that the champion is tuned such that only ultra mains can have a high win rate, and the vast majority of players cannot, and they're not even in pro play. Who exactly are we serving with this tuning? And it does mean that we're boiling back down to solo queue, but and we're boiling back down to win rate even. But I'm going to shift the conversation slightly. I'm gonna move the goalpost maybe, and I'm going to say win rate is not necessarily the direct measurement of power, but the win rate is a good measurement of how successful the champion is in the current version of the game with their current player base. And this means that champions could absolutely sit above or below 50% win rate for lots of good reasons. There can be an absolutely good reason why Azir should be 48 forever. Because we're like, actually, his mastery curve, we look at it, and it's very, very steep, and we know the average Azir only has like 3 games on him. You know what? Azir is 48. And at 20 games and beyond, you're above 50, and that can be an okay call. Like, we, of course, can make that call. But anyway, to circle back to the point, Azir is a champ that pretty much is ceilinged by how good he is in pro play. And That's just the case. But this does, to go back to the point I was saying, is that this actually does serve him quite well. Azir's pick rate, I measured both last year and this year, so I've got 2 years of data at this point, and Azir's pick rate is very, very heavily influenced by his pro presence more than other champions. More than any other champion I have investigated. There might be someone who is above him in this regard, but from the limited data that I have personally researched, Azir is the #1 most correlated champion between solo queue presence and pro play presence. That just the fact that he is in pro play makes people go play Azir. And so this means that above any other champion that I know of, Azir's people's enjoyment of Azir is driven by him being pro viable. I also believe that Azir is one of the more interesting pro champions. Personal opinion, but if I'm going to rank mages, I think Azir is high tier. I think Orianna is high tier. I will say that for a mage, I think Victor is relatively low tier. And this is not just a staleness thing. This is what they actually do, their level of playmaking. Also, I'm salted that TSM got kicked out of the group stage because of double lift. But moving on, we probably shouldn't see Lucian either. That's the kind of thing. Regardless, this is a pretty light change to Azir. The point is, I expect to see Azir at Worlds. I am happy to see Azir at Worlds. We're not trying to kick Azir out of Worlds. We are doing a cooldown nerf that is at full power until champion level 8. In which case it slowly wears down until champion level 13, where there is no nerf. But from levels 2 through 12, this is an Azir nerf. It is not a huge one, but it will have a little bit of impact, and that is fine. If Azir is a top 4 mid laner at Worlds, cool, sounds good. Next is Renekton. Renekton has for a very long time lived in a world where he is much like Azir, ceilinged by pro play, but I think Renekton is not the same kind of champion as Azir, despite both being ascended, and they can both live in the same LOR deck, and they're both in the same TFT set, and all these things. Azir is a 4-cost versus a 1-cost. He doesn't deserve to have the same level of agency. Now, what I'm actually talking about here is the fact that Renekton does not have that same promise of, I'm this really high-skilled champion. Of course, you've got to be the best of the best of the best to play me. That is not the promise of Renekton, which means Renekton being pro-skewed kind of sucks. And that's rough. And so if we can try to be clever and find ways to unpro-skew Renekton in sort of inoffensive ways, I think that is a good thing for League of Legends. And it's a good thing for Renekton players, because I think, whereas Azir literally skyrockets pick rate because Faker picked them, Renekton is not the same boat. And so it would be good, I think, to, in the short term, in the medium term, and at some time frame, unpro-skew Renekton. And so, of course, the point here is that, yes, Renekton is base MR by 4. But the thing is, if you go and look at solo queue, and you look at the champions people play in solo queue, now there are some relatively common champions who deal some magic damage. Malphite is relatively common. Jax has a decent magic damage profile and is very common. Camille does basically 0 magic damage, so he doesn't count, but her ulti, that's fake, obviously. But the running theory, to somewhat oversimplify, is that, well, Renekton is so common in pro play because he is a very safe blind pick where no matter what they pick, you're probably going to have lane prio. People like to have lane prio. You're going to have a winning laning phase. Nothing's going to hurt you that badly. And so, who cares? We'll play Renekton. If we want to strong side him, we can gank for him with Sejuani. If we want to weak side him, that's fine. He can press R and frontline for us at a decent level in team fights. Do we want it? Renekton can do it. Great. Anyone remember the old Kale can do it meme? Shout out if you remember the Kale can do it meme from actually 10 years ago, because I remember the Kale can do it meme. Either way, it feels like we're honestly at a Renekton can do it kind of meme. And so the point here, and I'm not saying this we have solved Renekton with one line. I'm not saying that is true. But what I am suggesting is that this is directionally a good change to say that if the entire reason we see so much Renekton in pro play is because he is a safe blind pick, he's got no counter, he's unpunishable, and he'll do any job. And unfortunately, he's not even that good in solo queue. Well, if you lower your MR enough, we might see that someone like Gwen or Rumble or Kennen, and to be fair, I don't know the matchup tables very well. My understanding is Gwen is pretty good here, but I'm not a very skilled top laner. This also wasn't my change specifically, though I do think it's a good change, but to say, look, somewhere out there's going to be a good magic damage matchup that you can play into Renekton and feel good about, and he becomes a less safe blind pick, and so we don't just have #1 prio top laner Renekton for all of the World Championship. I think it is somewhat unlikely this will be the case here. So this is the hope, this is the dream. Renekton will absolutely be a top 4 champion at Worlds in top lane. I think that is very likely to be true. I think that is okay. I would, to be honest, personally, my opinion is I would rather the top lane metagame at Worlds be Renekton, Jax, Cassante, and Rumble. If that's your top 4, I would much rather have that be the top 4 than Malphite, Sion, Ornn, pick a 4th tank, probably still Cassante, right? Malphite, Sion, Ornn, Cassante is a worse pro meta than the one from before. I would rather it be, arguably damage-focused champions, ones who have the ability to create solo kills and take the game under their hands and make big plays. In general, in pro play, sort of want the more agile champions, the ability to pop off and do cool things, give each role the ability to carry. If you want to play strong side, you've got good strong side champions. You want to play weak side top and play for bot lane, you can play for bot side, but have each side be available. That's the hope here. That's the dream. And that's very lightly in the direction of what we're doing here. But again, comfortable with Renekton being a clearly viable top laner in pro play. Next change is a nerf to Zary. Essentially, we signed up for this work a little while ago because it is unabashedly curating the pro meta. It's saying, okay, obviously some teams will play for a late game hyper carry as their bot lane champion. Obviously, despite everyone being called a marksman, the ways in which Lucian versus Caitlyn versus Draven versus Kalista versus Zary versus Xayah versus Aphelios versus Kai'Sa versus Ashe versus Jhin, the way these champs each influence the game are different. That's like saying Renekton and Jax are the same champ because they're melee fighters with a dash and a stun. It's like, well, there's clearly some overlap, but that's reductive to say that they're the same champion. Obviously, there's going to be teams that are going to play for late game damage focused, like the point of the champion is to receive gold and turn gold into damage. We are basically saying that we want the number 1 champion of that class to be Kai'Sa for Worlds. We nerfed Kai'Sa back in 13.15. From LEC data, she was a 58% presence AD carry. Above her was Kalista, above her was Xayah, which means, hey, we seem to have viable lane bullies. Great. We nerfed Xayah in the previous patch, which we think will have meaningful impact in her pro presence. This should make her roughly tie or hopefully go a little bit below Kai'Sa. And then secondary to that, we saw that Zary was creeping up in presence, and we said, look, Zary is the kind of champion that we think will feel kind of stale in pro play. This kind of champion that probably can be a successful and well-liked champion at a 47 or 48% resting win rate in solo queue. Zary might just require more mastery than the average AD carry, to be fair. And Zary, to my understanding, has a sharper mastery curve than the average AD carry. This actually might be balanced. She might be balanced with a lower win rate than Ashe because of mastery curves, right? Depending on the inflection point you pick, of course, but again, depending on where you want to set your goals, this can, of course, just be true, even if the resting win rate is something different. Regardless, this is obviously unabashedly a pro-focused change, because despite pro presence for Zary going to roughly 0% when the update happened back in 0.11 or 0.12, she has crept all the way back up to around 50% recently, and so this is an abundance of caution saying that we do not want Zary to be the go-to default hyper carry option. She should be 3rd or 4th place behind maybe Aphelios, Kai'Sa, and someone else. This is the call. If we can unpro skew Zary, I don't know if we actually want to, but right now this is the kind of situation that we are in and the call that we have made. Next is a not pro skewed or not a pro reason change, but to Reeksai. So I will totally take ownership of the fact that the last few Reeksai changes were mine. This was the E damage reshape and the Q damage reshape were the changes that I concepted, got approved and implemented. They were directionally good, but magnitude-wise, they were not good enough. Reeksai is a champion who is incredibly elite skewed. Some of this is the fact that she is somewhat unorthodox and hard to play, and MMR correlates very tightly with the number of games of League of Legends you actually play in a given week, and so thus the amount of mastery you have on any given champion on the roster. That will tend to be true. Reeksai is a high mastery champion. She is one of the highest in the game. She is also an early game skewed champion because she basically bypasses all of the rules around early ganks. Also, her last max is completely miserable and does absolutely nothing per skill point. She doesn't have any scaling past level 13. So I think it's okay in general that there are early game and late game skewed champions. You actually want to have different power curves available within any given role and across different roles, right? That's valuable, that's useful. And so I'm not specifically trying to continue to shape early versus late game. There is some of that here, but not a ton. It's smoothing off the really, really rough edges that feel really bad. So earlier the tactics were, sand off some early game, make the late game a bit better as a make good because high elo games end quicker because either people limit test even harder and or teams are just better at closing out to make fewer mistakes from ahead. And so, the snowball completes and the game ends. Some of these are true. Some of these are not true. Regardless, certainly games do end sooner in higher elo. So any early game champion who falls off a cliff just doesn't see the bad part of the power curve in high elo games nearly as often. And so you have win rate fluctuations. So both these systems, right, this early late game skew as well as mastery skew, are both very real. They both totally exist. And though we had undone some early versus late game power on Reeksai in the past, we're not doing that here. In fact, we're arguably different our late game more than our early game at this point. Again, it's fine as a champion, it is early game skewed, but it's, what is your overall throughput as a champion? Anyway, so the point here is that Reeksai is presently around a 54 and change % win rate jungler in really high MMR. That is generally not an acceptable win rate to have at any skill curve. Like, again, the whole 48 to 52 we're totally comfortable with. It is interesting how often I see players say, my favorite champion is horrible. The win rate is 49.5. And it's like, I disagree. You're using the wrong terms for that. Regardless, again, something really extreme like 46 looks really bad. Something really extreme like 54 looks way too good. So there is some level of clamping we're willing to do just by saying, I see win rate, we're going to make a change. We still have the right to say, I see this win rate, I don't care. For example, Rammus not getting nerfed this patch despite being incredibly good in low elo. We can talk about it a little bit later. We'll talk about nerfs we didn't do in a little bit. But this is to say, hey, Reeksai, you clearly are doing too well. And so what this is doing is essentially targeting things that are disproportionately used by highly skilled players. This does mean we're technically lowering her mastery curve somewhat, but it also means that we're making her, I think, a much more fair champion. We'll go kind of line by line. First off, this is a very simple numbers change. I was considering it being 30 to 50 when first making the change of Q from base damage to total AD. Essentially, one of the oddities around Reeksai is that finishing maxing Q is incorrect. And by creating Q in total AD, it actually helped ensure that you want to get the points in. But now going even harder on the per level, on the per rank, helps you re-incentivize this. But ultimately, the scaling of maxing E is so strong that it's just clearly correct to finish maxing E. And maybe we soften that over time. Maybe we do something else there. But that's sort of unintuitive. It's okay if it's just like a point of interesting choice. But like it's just clearly correct to max E after 3 points Q. And so softening that difference, I think, is reasonable, right? I'm a fan of there being choice in skill order, not, oh, you didn't realize? No, actually, this choice over here is the correct one, but you never realized it, right? Like that's sort of like trapping players versus like letting you have sort of an intuitive choice between options. Kind of a random point there, but it is something that is in the back of my mind that I try to think about when making changes like this. So it's going in that direction. The second thing, the actual numbers are pretty nitty gritty here, but essentially levels 1 through 4, it's not really any different. You can't even get bro healing until level 2 anyway, but the healing is pretty much not changed for your first clear and your first gank. It's negligible. It's like 3 total health per burrow. It doesn't matter. But taking a very heavy swing at her late game overall healing, it still scales really, really sharply with champion level. What it's going to do, though, is going to make top lane Reeksai much, much worse because top lane Reeksai uses this passive a lot. But it's also the kind of thing that just is, I'm gonna oversimplify here, so I don't really mean all the words I'm saying, but it's a little bit unintuitive how to use the healing on Reeksai, and it's like just press W forehead, but there's like a lot of like weird like UI stuff that's just not as clean as it could be. I don't really want to get into it, but ultimately, Reeksai still has more than enough healing late game via her passive. It's still like well over 300 points of healing in a like conventional 3 to 4 item late game build if you reach all the way there for the very last point with the heaviest nerf here at level 18. But regardless, it's still like, yep, this is what we're doing. We're nerfing the amount of healing Reeksai gets because honestly, she gets a lot of healing. It is something that disproportionately highly skilled players provide. She's still going to be a high skill cap champion. There's still a lot to learn about this champion. But hey, one of your strongest outputs that is really, really too strong, that's relatively hard to appreciate, that's top lane skill, which is like not a great gameplay experience. We're bringing it down, and this is going to obviously hurt her. Next thing is a very substantial nerf to her burrowed move speed. This is minus 10 to minus 15 move speed while burrowed based on champion level. The minus 10 is level 2 through 15. The minus 15 is level 16. There's no longer a level 16 breakpoint for gaining more move speed. I think longer term, what we should actually do is give Reeksai 5 more base move speed and then get rid of the burrowed MS. In my opinion, the what being burrowed gives you is the ability to map hack with Tremor Sense, and then, go launch a tunnel or launch a Prey Seeker, but otherwise your champion functions. I think the fewer extra rules we add on being burrowed, the better for the champion. League is a game with, now closer to 200 to 100 champions in the roster, and the more unnecessary rules we can get rid of that just aren't needed for the understandability of a champion, the better. The fact that Reeksai's vision system changes, wow, that's a really meaningful button press. It's really important that we do this. The fact that her Q and E become different spells, wow, it's really meaningful. This is a valuable button press. New things happen. The fact that you run faster isn't required. If Reeksai needs to be relatively fast, she can be relatively fast at all points in time. She can go match the base move speed of Garen and Darius and such, and that's totally reasonable. But the fact that this champion has more base move than Master Yi just because she's burrowing under the ground, I don't believe is a required a necessary point for Reeksai. If anything, the fact that she should be able to rely on tunnels to get around the map is more compelling than my base move speed is just Master Yi's base move speed, well burrowed. And so it's the kind of thing where directionally, I actually wish I had thought of this lever sooner and went after the level sooner. I believe it's just correct for the champion. This also does mean that her early gank power, when her tunnels aren't set up yet, right? We should play up unique niches, right? The tunnel network is the important thing. Right? We can play towards that, right? High skill cap, right? We can make the skill expression meaningful, but just saying, oh yeah, remember to burrow. This is where all your power is, I think is much less compelling and not valuable. And so I think it's a very strong lever. This is obviously very meaningful, but essentially much less out of combat move speed. She still has the tunnel gank pass. She still has a lot of power there, but hey, you don't get to essentially break the game's underlying move speed rules, which I think is more than reasonable. Finally, it's a make good. I've been trying to do some make good changes every time we nerf Reeksai to try to bridge this gap somewhat. I mean, Reeksai's late game is I don't mind a champion, to be clear, having an early versus late game power curve. Elise is an early game champion. Lee Sin is an early game champion. Renekton is an early game champion. That's fine. Darius is an early game champion. But the thing is, these champions function in the late game, right? Darius is not a great late game champion, but his entire kit functions in the late game. It does. He is a functional champion at level 17. Lee Sin is a functional champion at level 17. It requires a lot around acrobatics getting a cool kick, but Lee Sin has a functional gameplay pattern at level 17. I don't believe Reeksai really has a functional gameplay pattern whenever it has rank 3 ultimates. I think we have to do more than make the W rank up nicer, but the fact of the matter is, when you put a point in Q, you get a cooldown incentive on unburrowed Q and burrowed Q. You get a damage increase on unburrowed Q and burrowed Q. When you rank up E, you get a damage incentive on unburrowed E. You also get not only a tunnel summon, but a tunnel reuse cooldown bump on the E. And in the current live game, when you put a point in W, you gain 15 damage on unburrow. That's it. That's clearly horrible, right? That's clearly well below the bar for an ability rank up. That's horrible. That is really bad. Now, to be fair, this is now giving you 35 damage per rank up. That's still really bad. And it could be that we can build a version of Reeksai where the W rank up is actually unburrowed cooldown or unburrowed knock-up duration or stun duration, or the tunnel reuse cooldown could be based. I'm not saying it should be, right? I'm not giving this a ton of thought and here's the next set of changes, but it's W is clearly such a bad skill to rank up that it like hurts me to understand that this is happening. That's really all I'm really kind of trying to say here. That I do think that there is work that could be done on Reeksai to make her feel like a more functional champion, and she can still be the tunnel queen. She can still like be an on average good ganker. She can still be early game skewed, but we can make her a functional champion at all points in time. And I feel like this might have to come from like we have to maybe bring down some of her early game power, but like allowing her to be fully functional to me is more than reasonable. I think a overall good choice. But anyway, that is longer down the line. That is a different topic, but this is happening here. Want to briefly talk about nerfs we didn't submit. So one of them is Cassante. One of them I think we were talking about earlier. Then I don't remember what it was, but there's another nerf that we didn't do that I like remembered and then didn't remember when scrolling down here. And I'm sorry, I don't have it. The big one though is Cassante. I've seen a lot of people, especially on the subreddit, be like, XD Lamau, why haven't you nerfed Cassante? And the reason we haven't nerfed Cassante is because Cassante is like the number 4 or 5 top laner in pro play, and we are essentially not moving the top lane metagame at all because I overall quite like the top lane metagame. So I'm going to sort of restate something that I'd said, I'm pretty sure in the Monday video, which was I would much rather have a metagame that I know is going to happen where I like what it looks like than roll the dice and make it random and no one knows what it looks like and it might be horrible. So for example, the MSI AD carry meta for the best teams was ban Lucian, only play Jinx of Phelios. Because going into that patch, we nerfed Caitlyn, and I forget what else we moved around, but essentially we just said, oh, well, we finally got the tank supports back, that's good, but we didn't have enough AD carries back in the pool, so we nerfed out Caitlyn, and now there's only 3. One's banned, now there's only 2. And it made for a very, very, very stale metagame. Using 13.14, which is the only playoff patch that more than one league played on, I don't believe there was a single top laner with a greater than 75% presence. Not a single top laner was over 75, which means the top lane meta was super wide. There was no must pick, no must ban. Everything was relatively open. Now, sure, there was like clearly about 5 champions in the A to S tier, but there wasn't a number 1 when you compare to like last year's Aatrox or 3 years ago's Gangplank or whatever. Like, we can all point towards, we're like, oh, look, it was 100% pick ban Nidalee. Wow, way to go, right? And the way you dodge that is by saying, the metagame is stable, the metagame is varied, we're just gonna keep it. I don't think there's another way to have that than to say, we've been stable, we've been stable, we've been stable. Honestly, we like the stability. Go for it. I think that is a very defensible line of structuring game balance as we head into a major tournament. I think that is a very defensible choice to make. So this is going to go back to say Cassante is like a 55% present top laner. So you see him played in about 1 out of 4 games. He's banned sometimes, he's picked sometimes. More often than either one of those, he goes through champ select undisturbed because his other top laners teams would rather play. And by not disturbing the top lane meta very much, now to be fair, we buffed Gwen a bit, we nerfed Renekton a bit, but everything else is the same. We also buffed Kennen a bit. This means we should still have a pretty varied top lane metagame. Even the fact that like you can use Renekton as against Cassante in the 1-on-1 if you really wanted to, that matchup hasn't changed because Renekton lost some MR and Cassante literally can't deal magic damage. Unless he buys a Sunfire Cape or a Bramble Vest, which negligible. So, like, that's why we haven't nerfed Cassante. One, of the tanks, he is one of the most skill-expressive ones. Like, if you're going to play weak side top lane, now to be fair, there are other very exciting tanks out there. Like, Ornn is a pretty cool guy, Sion's a pretty cool guy. But, like, yeah, Cassante actually makes plays. When you have Cassante versus X in the top lane compared to, like, Sion versus X in the top lane, you actually might have kills in the 1-on-1. You actually might have some sick plays. That's a good thing. The ability for your top lane to have a 1-on-1 kill when one team wants to play a tank, if the best tank is Cassante, that means top lane gets to be volatile. Congratulations, this is a good thing for League of Legends. I know the copy pasta is out there and it's very nice and easy to meme, but like, yes, Cassante is a highly skill expressive tank. generally a positive for the pro scene. So yeah, right. And the weird thing is like the comments that get upvoted is like XD, we're gonna see 100% Cassante. It's like, what have you been watching that makes you think it's gonna be 100% Cassante? Like this could happen out of nowhere, but all data indicates that teams are like, he's like the third or fourth top laner. We'll play him sometimes. And there's no reason to think that's going to change for any meaningful degree. So I don't see why there should be a pressing need for making Cassante changes, unless again they go to 100% out of nowhere for who knows the reasons. Let's move on to the next set of changes, which are champion buffs. So these are a mix of changes, largely driven by this champion appearing a bit weak in solo queue. These are champions who either have a resting win rate below 50%, or their win rate is 50 and change, but we think that they maybe deserve to live above that because, like, this champion would be balanced because their matchup tables are so positive to the current metagame. Like this is Malphite, where it's like, hey, Jax and Jace are really, really popular top lane champions, and most solo queue team comps are actually for AD, because there aren't a lot of AP junglers out there. And again, we know how common Zed, Yasuo, Yone are. Okay, well, all those factors means that Malphite should just rest at like 53% win rate because the metagame constantly favors him. Right? And it's like, actually, if Malphite's balanced, he's 53. And it could be that we actually should be buffing Malphite. But there are other times where it's like, oh, this champion has a low wisting win rate. And it could be that they're meant to, or maybe they're not meant to. There's, there is some diving in that could be done. Regardless, let's go champion by champion in what we're doing here. So Galio, very simple change. Honestly, the impetus here is saying, okay, Galio is resting sub 50. He's not really in the metagame. Maybe with a small buff, we could see him at Worlds. It's not really the primary goal here. It's just, yeah, this champion hasn't been winning a lot of games for quite a while. And this is saying, look, we can further exacerbate his AP versus AD matchup spread, but we're actually relatively comfortable with his current like ability into magic damage mid laners. And instead saying, okay, well, if this champion's underperforming, we should instead go buff his other unique niche, which is the fact that he has a global. And so it's 20 seconds cooldown off the global to say, yeah, when you see Galio, what you're getting is, a mid lane mage tank hybrid with a global, and games are going to play out differently with Galio in them, and they're going to play out differently more if he's ulting a little bit more. It's a very light thing. We're not really overthinking this, but ultimately, yeah, he's going to have some more globals. The fact that it's not a true global, the fact that, it does require moving over toward a champion, the fact that, there's a long delay in landing. It's one of the, I would say, less abusive globals out there. Right, TF is free targeted. Shen is purely global, and even if you interrupt him, I mean, okay, the Galio shield shows up anyway as well, but like, it's kind of thing where it's like, yeah, I think this cooldown is allowed to rest, below 200 seconds. Simple buff here. It's going to be a little bit of win rate, probably a little bit under 1%, but he's not terribly weak, so it's a fine change. Next is Gangplank, where somewhat of a similar boat. Essentially, this is Gangplank. Clearly doesn't appear to be a strong performer in any skill bracket. He isn't seeing pro play either. He's not ceiling by pro play. We're not trying to re-pro skew him. Like, there was a world where Gangplank had to be like a 46% win rate solo queue champion while just sitting there in pro play. We don't want to get that space back, but identifying levers on the kit that are reasonable that we can return to the champion, and just things that honestly have kind of fallen by the wayside and are just kind of weak right now. So the first thing is just 10 seconds off the ultimate cooldown. We have a win rate budget here. There was a version of this change that was 20 to 10 seconds off the R cooldown. We chose to go for a little bit less magnitude here, but to say, yeah, you've got your ultimate up a bit more often. The unique niche is that Gangplank has a global. Yep, global is going to be a bit stronger. The ability to split push and play around the map a bit more. Cool, right? Like, there is a little bit of a theme here where we've buffed two globals this patch, and so trying to play a more split map playstyle is going to be more viable, and we'll see if that ends up being a thing that pops up in solo queue a bit more. We'll see if it ends up being a thing that pops up at Worlds this year. But again, Gangplank, on average, underperforming in solo queue, so, room to buff him. The second thing is just identifying that clearly two of his upgrades are far below the volley fire one, and so it's like, okay, you're not probably going to change your like level up order. You're probably still going to go for the overall just more cannonballs, but increasing death threat are slow from 60 to 75%. Worth noting that both the tooltip and the wiki are wrong. This is not 1.5 seconds and 1.0 seconds. And the second thing is actually plus 20%. No, sorry, it's plus 10%. Raise Morale's move speed going from, I believe it's either 20 to 30 or 30 to 40 percent move speed to allies running through it. Again, not meant to be a very, very big deal, but saying, hey, the Gangplank ulti upgrades should matter. We should try to hit a bar where it's impactful that you hit this upgrade, that you care about it to a certain degree, to the level that like you care about Kai'Sa evolves and Kha'Zix evolves. This champion has an evolve mechanic. We should probably raise the power level to the point where he actually feels good about gathering this. And so moving in this direction to say, hey, you're going to care, this is going to have a meaningful impact. And maybe it should go a little bit farther, but this is the amount of win rate budget we think we have for him, and just trying to increase parts of the kit that, aren't satisfying and can be. Next thing is some Jhin damage. So the underlying rule here, number one, is Jhin, again, looks to be a little bit weak. Jhin tends to get to rest at an above 50% win rate, while being a very reasonable champion. The fact that he's providing crowd control to his team, the fact that he will allow other roles to take farm. I mean, even just having viable weak side bot laners is a good thing for games playing out differently. One interesting thing, a bit of data I've seen, is as MMR rises, the likelihood that you gank bot instead of top also rises. Better players have identified, or at least believe, that they should be ganking bot lane instead of top lane. I mean, some of this is it's very easy at lower elos to autopilot and have your dual lane leash. This is like just the default thing that people just kind of do. It's the autopilot thing. And so getting out of autopilot says, oh yeah, I could consider a different pathing situation. But regardless, it's still anyway. That is an undercurrent here, which is to say, hey, I think it's valuable if there are good weak side bot laners. And Jhin, to me, makes sense as a champion who is at least partially about crowd control, right? Like, Kai'Sa can't really be a weak side bot laner without her being able to build tank to do damage, because her only outputs are damage, and this is fine. Like, Xayah and Kai'Sa and Caitlyn, like, they're all going to be champions where it's like your only output is damage. This is just how your champion works. That's fine. Let's give some breadth to the AD carry role, to the bot lane marksman sort of suite of champions, and give some breadth in the way that we have Jax and Malphite in the same champion pool up in top lane, where one is really high agency, one is low agency. The roles they provide are very different. That's valuable. Let's do it on a roster level down in bot lane as well. Let's have, right, some more utility-focused champions. And I realize we're not buffing his utility. I'm aware of this. But Jhin is already a utility-skewed marksman. He provides a lot of utility. That's good. Okay, so then why are we buffing our damage? Well, essentially, I'm a really big fan of, and I've mentioned it in a couple of videos before, your ults having a decently high amount of baseline value. There's a couple of thoughts here with Jhin that all matter. So one, Jhin has to give up auto-attacking for a long time to use his ultimate, which means this thing has to have an aggressive enough to AD ratio that if you are doing well and you're snowballing and you're like level 10 on Mythic plus Legendary with rank 1 ulti, the inherent AD ratio has to be high enough that it's not a trap to press R. Because, of course, the shots can miss, and, of course, you have to give up auto-attacking in order to use his ability at all in the first place. So it has to have enough ratio that even if you are snowballing, you still have enough going on because you're directly trading off auto-attack. So the fact that this has an AD ratio at all, and a total AD ratio at that, which is what he's going to use when he auto-attacks, makes total sense and is completely on theme for what this ability has to do. On the other hand, I do want this ability to have a good amount of baseline damage so that if he's having a bad game, like any other champion, you can press R and have a good level of output where no matter how badly you're doing, you can press R, and pressing R is going to be useful. And so I am, in general, a fan of shepherding the game very, very slightly towards, moderate cooldown, solidly high impact, and with exceptions for very good reasons, does not require your gold scaling to be impactful. Now, some things are Karthus R or Fiddlesticks R, and this is like, no, these things clearly have to scale with AP to a large degree, because all they do is provide damage. These champions are not meant to build tank, and, yes, absolutely, right? Like, there are going to be exceptions. It's not a rule for every single thing, but hey, when we have room, baseline output for ultimates, to me, is a valuable thing. There is a limit to where we can't do this anymore, right? But in the short term, I think we can go much higher, or at least somewhat higher than we are now, in terms of baseline ultimate output. Okay. Anyway, this maths out to being 14% more damage on Jhin R using example builds. Obviously, if you are far ahead of the curve, it's a bit less. If you're far behind the curve, it's a bit more. But overall, more Jhin R damage. right? It's allowing him to be stronger in weak side situations. It's allowing him to be a solid weak side carry. He's going to get some, of course, winner out of this, but it also allows him to have a strategic niche. So it's like, actually, it's Gigabin time. We're going to play weak side bot lane. We're going to go play for top carry. You should have viable options that allow you to play strategically with different goals from your opponents. This is I've lamented many times about nerfing Caitlyn before MSI. I think, just talking about lane specifically, I think we should have multiple viable lane bullies. We should have multiple viable hyper carries, and we should have multiple viable weak side bot laners as well. I think all of those are important and should be viable and available. And of course, the same goes true for other roles as well. Alrighty, next thing up is a pretty substantial buff to Lee Sin. So the primary change was this. It was +2 base armor and then an increase on his W. Keep in mind this is +5% Omnivamp until champion level 8. And then it goes down, then down, then down. And it's actually 1% less Omnivamp in the late game. So it is an early game buff to Lee Sin, not a late game buff to Lee Sin. In fact, there's even a further late game nerf to Lee Sin here. So back when I was the one who shipped the Lee Sin buffs back in, I want to say like 13.3, around there. And I gave Lee Sin E a total AD ratio. I took off 65 base damage, and I gave it a total AD ratio so that his base AD would more than compensate for that damage. This allowed him, even though he was maxing W second, and it was still correct for him in the jungle to max W second, that even though he was maxing W second, his E would still be a worthwhile damage tool. As champions gained MR, maybe he didn't get a lot of AD, but it was still going to keep up to some degree because at level 13, he had gained another 40 base attack damage from champion levels, and so he got another 40 damage through his E, and so it keeps up just a little bit better than before, and I consider that very valuable, very, very important for this champion to sort of feel like he can keep up, because I think that's useful. When this change happened, I remember looking at his top lane and mid lane win rate data, because I knew there was going to be a strict buff to his E. And E is, of course, a very big tool for lane Lee Sin to wave clear. And at the time, we had plenty of win rate budget, where even if top lane and mid lane Lee Sin gained more than jungle Lee Sin, that would be fine. We had the win rate budget there where they would, tie at best. They wouldn't go beyond that. And that was true. We are now at a state where mid lane Lee Sin's win rate is roughly tied with jungle Lee Sin's win rate. Now, I believe in this change because I think Iron Will rank 1 is barely a skill. 5% window to Omnivamp is barely anything and really just exists to apply your passive. I think that is below the bar for a button press. And so I really wanted to give him an amount of Omnivamp that he can actually use and feel good about. And so this change. However, identifying the fact that Lee Sin jungle maxes W second, so at level 13, this stops being a buff and actually becomes a nerf. But of course, 1 through 12 is a buff, or 2 through 12 is a buff, and obviously he's going to get value out of that. The 2 armor, of course, also matters as well. But lane Lee Sin maxes W last, which means a buff until level 18, which games do not reach. And so it's a buff and, buff to power neutral for jungle, but a buff to buff for solo lane. Okay, well, we need to do a compensation nerf then for solo lane, and this was in the form of 0 to 20 damage off of E, because solo lane Lee Sin maxes this second. I actually ran the numbers to be sure. We could actually make this 0 to 40 damage off of E, and it would still be roughly power neutral compared to 13.1 for jungle Lee Sin, like E max last. It's like, it treads water a little bit around like 16, 17, but like it's functionally the same numbers, obviously just better until level like 14, 15. Regardless, we think 0 to 20 is reasonable and appropriately on magnitude. Obviously, this is going to be win rate positive. Again, up until champion level 8, lane Lee Sin will not feel this nerf at all, but he, of course, will feel these changes. I expect mid Lee Sin to gain some win rate here. I expect jungle Lee Sin to gain more. Lee Sin is a definitely exciting champion. This is the kind of thing where, somewhat similar to like Azir and whatnot, like, yeah, this is a champion who's exciting to watch, who's like very fun to play. And another sort of metric I'm going to bring up very briefly, but not spend a lot of time on, is the idea that champions are banned in unequal ways. So the example I used in the Monday video was comparing Rakan to Rel, where at similar win rates, with Rakan having a higher pick rate, Rel was actually banned more by players than Rakan was, which I'm going to take as a sort of blunt perspective of players don't seem to mind playing against strong Rakan as much as they mind playing against strong Rel, even though they play against strong Rakan more often. To a similar degree, now this one is harder to compare because winners are different. Nautilus has a substantially higher ban rate than Pike. Now, Nautilus has a higher win rate than Pike. Their pick rates are not that far apart. Not to the degree their ban rates are different. Now, again, the win rates are not comparable easily between Pike and Nautilus, so it's not nearly as fair of a comparison. But by a different comparison, if you compare, let's say, Nautilus to Thresh, Thresh wins as many games as Nautilus, is actually more common than Nautilus, but is banned far, far fewer times. Thresh appears to be another champion that players are willing to play against and comparatively not frustrated by. In terms of hook champions, people ban Blitzcrank, then Nautilus, then Pike, then Thresh. Now, again, the win rates are not one-to-one here, so there is an immediate bias in this data, but per pick rate, that's the stack rank of the things that people actively choose to say, I don't want to play against you. I find that very interesting. I think that is a very, very valuable bit of data to probably use arguably more than we have currently as a design team. It's something that I have brought up that seems to have had pretty positive reception and that will probably move forward with a certain degree. Again, this is going back to the fact that Lee Sin, now, to be fair, his win rates are fairly low, so people may be skipping on the bans because he doesn't actually win that many games when you're against him. We'll see what happens with, of course, his win rate going up here. But Lee Sin is a popular champion who, despite being popular, people do not seem to feel a desire to ban him. This could be a tuning thing, it could be something else, but we'll see when he gets tuned up where we go from there. But again, I think there is a world where it's like, yeah, you know what? And this is, again, going to overgeneralize. I don't believe this is actually the direction we're going to take. It's like, in a world where we let the strong champions be the ones that people don't seem to mind playing against, is the net fun of League of Legends just higher when that happens? Again, I have not dove deeply into this topic. I'm not saying this is actually the direction we're going to be taken by any means, but it's a thought I want to kind of pose. If you want to kind of, in the comments below, tell me how you feel about that. Feel free. It's a kind of thought that I wanted to kind of provide because I think there's at least something there, if not it being the actual hard and fast rule. Next is Lissandra. This is actually trying to move in the direction of differentiation. So over the past several years, we have tended to modify damage more than any other lever on kits. Now, the amount that we have buffed versus nerfed things is actually relatively consistent across each bracket. So the relative number of buffs and nerfs in damage, the relative number of buffs and nerfs in cooldowns, the relative number of buffs and nerfs in mana costs, those ratios are actually relatively equal across brackets, but damage has been by far our most common lever. And to be fair, it's really easy. Every single skill virtually has damage on it. Now, also every single skill has cooldown on it, and so we could have also been doing this whole time. They also, for 80% of champions, have a cost attached. So again, we can clearly choose damage more than anything else, and this might have been incorrect long term. But regardless, one thing we've definitely done this patch, but I would like to do it moving forward, is to try to further differentiate the roster so that there is significantly more variance from game to game, because a different champ select creates a significantly different game of League of Legends. I think there is a limit to how much people are willing to stomach globals, to be fair. But also, Shen is only okay right now. Gangplank is kind of weak right now. TF is only okay right now. Galio is kind of weak right now. A lot of our kind of core global champions outside of Ashe are neutral to arguably weak at this point in time. And maybe, again, there was an upper limit here, but maybe League could stand to have a few more globals right now. I don't consider Nocturne a global, by the way. That ulti range is 2,000. It's at rank 1 anyway. Regardless, whatever. Practically Reeksai range. Let's move forward, though. Anyway, this is a, hey, in this patch, and I think it would be good to do this going forward, let's try to embrace uniqueness as much as possible. Let's not break things, right? I don't think Lissandra should have a 17-second long chain CC combo, but it's look, okay, Lux Q is a flat 2-second long route. Now, to be fair, this thing is long range and can be spammed. It can be blocked by minions. There's lots of counterplay to Lux E. Lux Q, sorry. Lissandra W is instant cast, but it's also blocked by her being in melee range of you. So she has to flash W, or just use the claw that has even easier ways of reacting to than even Lux Q. Or she has to be against melee champs, in which case she has some sharper matchups. Now, again, there was an upper limit to it to how sharp we are willing to let matchups be. I think the extreme top end of top lane matchups is sharper than I think it should be in League of Legends. But I don't think Lissandra is anywhere close to Teemo Tryndamere or Malphite Sylas or Malphite Rumble levels of matchup sharpness. I don't want to reach that level of sharpness, but they're somewhere above where she is right now, where it's like, no, Lissandra is a really good anti-melee champion. If you see a lot of Zeds and Yones and Yasuos in your game, you can play Lissandra and feel good about it. And have this be a good counter pick. I think that is totally reasonable. It means that we will see elevated win rates for champions who are currently good against the currently popular champions in their role. Again, Malphite being 50% win laner, win rate top laner is a version of this. And people lost their damn minds when Malphite was a 53% top laner, despite his two most common matchups being Jax Jace, matchups that he is heavily favored into. So of course they're inflating his win rate. Regardless, again, it's a topic that requires further sort of deep diving into a later point in time. Not going to do too much here. Regardless, hey, let's ramp up uniqueness. Let's bring up Lissandra's root duration a bit. It's going to be some win rate. It's going to be some power. It's going to be disproportionately skewed toward melee matchups. And it's going to mean that Lissandra, when you pick her in the mid lane, is very much a crowd control mage. And there's lots of ways you can tune this champion, by the way. Like, for example, you could say that Lissandra, with no income, her baseline reliable output is that she has a lot of crowd control. Her Q now always slows. Her W is an instant cast root. Her R is a point and click stun. This is really valuable. Okay, great. And we could, for example, say the way we're going to give you agency is we're going to lower many of your damages, many of your base damages, but give you more aggressive than average ratios so that you're not always a burst mage. But if you are doing well, you can become one. It might be hard to get those kills because you have, your highest base damage might be 210 when most mages are like 250. But if you do get ahead, if you farm really well, you get some turret plates, you get a really good roam off, all right, well, you're going to scale, damage per point of ability power just as well as any other mage. And so it means that her, damage from AP versus base damage skew is different from other mages, but, for a good reason, right? That a poorly performing Lissandra always has crowd control, but a well-performing Lissandra can do as much damage as another mage. That shape makes sense, but it means you're breaking with other expectations around, whatever. But again, this can all make sense and be intelligent. Regardless, this sort of shape for Lissandra, hey, we're going to continue to try to emphasize what she provides as disruption, as crowd control, as frontlininess. Cool, right? No pun intended, but this means that games with Lissandra get to play out more differently than games with Everfrost Ahri, which I think is maybe a bit of an unfortunate build, to be fair. But let's move forward on the next topic here, which is we are buffing AP Nunu. So right now, AP Nunu has about the same pick rate as Tank Nunu. So they are equally popular, to be clear. We want to support both versions of Nunu. Now, I believe we should support Tank Nunu as the overall stronger version. This was true with Twitch. This was true with Kaisa. If the alt build is better than the main build, I think it betrays the champion. I am fine if AP Nunu becomes popular the way that we're fine if AP Shyvana is popular. But I do think it betrays the champion somewhat if the alt build ends up overtaking the core build, the air quotes intended build, in observed power level. I think that is a very defensible stance to take. Regardless, Nunu R already has a 3.0 AP ratio on full channel, and Nunu W already has a 1.5 AP ratio on the big snowball. The amount of burst damage Nunu has through those tools is already very high. What I've intended to do here, I did these changes personally, is give him more gameplay than simply be a burst mage. And this means that if AP Nunu is good, it's going to require more out of him, and it's going to give more room for his opponents to have some say on how they play. Maybe being able to flay him out gets you out of the E range. Maybe being able to, Leona as tank one for the team, walk up and tank the snowballs with her shield up, right? There's gameplay around this. Obviously with the snowball you have that as well. Sure, obviously you can stun the ulti, yes, but, letting every button matter. I think in general, anytime you're making an alt build, I would say you probably want to default to each button mattering, but you can come in and say, actually, it's valuable if let's say for AD Twitch, his passive is there as a way to make his E work, but the damage there is mostly flavor. It's actually about the stacks. And then for AP Twitch, it's actually, my W is a way better crowd control tool than it is for AD Twitch, and my passive is actually a damage source compared to AD Twitch, and my ultimate is actually just a passive applicator, not a DPS modifier. Right? AD Twitch says, I press R, I gain like 70 attack damage. This multiplies with my crit chance, this multiplies with my attack damage, multiplies with my armor penetration. I can crit all these champions. I'm going to mow down the whole team during a combo. Let's go. AD just goes, man, I'm so excited. I'm going to get 6 stacks of pass on everybody. And the bonus AD is icing. You know, it's just there. Like that. Like the fact is, each button has a purpose to serve. Those purposes are different. That's great. That's actually desirable, honestly, for alternate builds on champions. This anyway circles back to the fact that, hey, AP Nunu's E should have a good enough AP ratio to feel like it's part of the kit, such that if AP Nunu is good, he has to rely on another button and not just be a burst mage. We'll see what win rate this is. I am hoping ballparking around 2% win rate for AP Nunu, which is about the stomach we have right now for win rate growth here. We'll see, but that's the way we're going right now. AP Nunu should be hopefully getting about 2% win rate, and that's the goal here. Next thing is an update to Pyke. We had dragged our heels a bit on Pyke buffs for a little while because we had gone in and updated Assassin itemization quite a bit. One unfortunate thing is that Pyke players are giga trolling their builds. Duskblade is not the Pyke item. I understand the idea of the synergy of pressing R, getting the kill, and going untargetable to allow you the space to get a second reset. The problem is the other unique passive on Duskblade, which I believe actually carries more of the power, which is the more damage when low on health, does not interact in any meaningful way with Pyke R. Pyke R shortcuts one of the 2 unique passives of Duskblade. And yet he's still buying this item, and I think that's really weird. I think it's incorrect. Clearly, Umbral's good on him. Clearly, Yomu's is good on him. Heck, it even gives him roaming speed, which is what a support assassin wants. And for some reason, people are going Duskblade. They are very, very wrong here, so his win rate is heavily deflated by bad builds. Regardless, even with that in mind, we think there is a bit of room for some small buffs. These are going to be pretty minor. We are aware that Pyke kind of falls off a cliff. So there's a very light nudge towards your late game builds are a little bit better, with health growth being a late game stat and his W cooldown. If you max it last, okay, it kicks in from level 14 onwards. It's not that late into the game, though it is relatively late, of course. But it's also partially saying that, you know what, there's maybe a bit of room for you to consider maxing W second as Pyke. The win rate delta between W second and E second is not that large. We think with a relatively small tap, we can make it occasionally correct to go max W second. When there's nothing game breaking about this, when there's clearly a gameplay to this ability loop, we're generally a fan of opening up more build options because this is a what I would say is an intuitive way of skill mastery. Right? When you can have alternate builds because it makes sense, or alternate skill because it makes sense, or alternate, evolves because it makes sense, is like, Kha'Zix, Gangplank, whatever. That's a really cool intuitive way to say, actually, these builds are relatively balanced. If you're good, you're going to choose correctly. But there's not like a trap bad option, unless we're just like not willing to make it let it be a good option, which in some cases this could be true. But I think that is generally a pretty positive thing, pretty valuable, pretty viable, and a thing that I kind of want to push here. So I'm glad it's happening. I think it's a very good change structurally for the game. That if over the course of this year, we absolutely have closed the gap on ability ranks. We landed it on Aphelios. W versus E second are same win rate, which means you can choose based on enemy team comp. We're closing the gap here on Pyke. We closed the gap a little bit on Lee Sin. To be fair, we're opening it back up. And it's just different based on what role you play, so our hands are kind of tied. But I know there are other changes at other points in time that I know had actually hit this. So generally pretty happy with what we've been able to do here. Regardless, again, I think there's pretty good changes to Pyke. This interchange, again, she's not necessarily in a bad spot in solo queue. This is meant to just be a head turner. She certainly has room for discretionary buffing. I believe there's room for discretionary saying, hey, Syndra, she's fine, but we think Syndra should be allowed to be good. So we're going to give Syndra some damage to allow her to be good. Her power level is going to be good. She's going to be above average. We are choosing as designers that Syndra is going to be an above average champion in the short term. I think it's well within our rights to do that and make that choice and make this call here. It's one more mage who's good in the mid lane, which is probably powerful. Another thing to point out is that Syndra is a good champion against Tristana. She has a favorite matchup. She just crushes Rocket Jump really easily. It makes her entire combo very easy to throw in. We again nerfed Tristana's base health and base MR, which opens her up against burst mages like Syndra. Very, very light meta release lever against some of the best performing champions. One of the best performing champions in pro play this split. Final champion is an update to Twitch. This is plus 25% missile speed on the R. There was initially a much higher scope version of this change list, which had things like reshaping the damage fall off on R and the damage minimum cap, and then a compensation nerf to the bonus AD on the ability. Ultimately, we decided to just go a little bit lower risk and just say missile speed. Twitch is currently a successful champion in League of Legends. I don't think there's any way you can look at him and say, we think Twitch is a weak champion. We don't think he's necessarily overpowered. I think he's on the strong side for AD carries. But that's fine. I think it's okay to say, look, he's kind of strong. This happened with Bard last patch. Reddit lost their minds, and it turns out Bard is still just kind of strong. So Twitch is kind of strong, and he'll remain kind of strong this patch. There are estimates between this being like 0.25% win rate and like north of 1% win rate. If Twitch gains a full 1% win rate, it is very likely that we will give Twitch a small compensation nerf in 0.20. But regardless, the whole point here is that so I'm going to talk about reliability. And not just reliability, but variance. So again, I think game-to-game variance is very, 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 very important for League of Legends. Part of what has made League stand the test of time, why I'm still playing it for literally 14 years. I started around this time back in 2009 playing League of Legends, and I still play League of Legends. I still absolutely love playing this game, is that games play out differently. And it's not just because it's players versus players. There are plenty of PvP games that I have stopped playing because I just moved on to other more novel experiences, games that I've played almost as many hours of as League of Legends at a certain point in time. But I think at this point, League is my most played game of all time. I don't think I've played anything for 14 years at this point. But regardless, not just are players a source of variance, but actual game construction, and this is just saying champ select, that, games themselves play out differently. And this is why playing up champions' unique niches is valuable. Twitch, as a potentially unreliable marksman, is kind of interesting. I personally also really like playing Twitch. Twitch as a very good roaming AD carry. You can turn lane prio into a mid lane kill, and very few other AD carriers are this good at that. I really enjoy that part of Twitch, playing Twitch as a quasi-assassin. That really appeals to me as a player. But another thing that's actually really unique to Twitch is that he has a very strong team fight ultimate. Like Jinx R, yeah, it's good in team fights, but like Jinx R up versus down, not a big variance driver. Kog'Maw, not a big variance driver. Xayah, well, she might be safer, but depending on team comp, could be not, in any way a variance driver. Aphelios, it can matter, right? But like, really what you care about is like, are you green, white, or red, white? Okay, you're full power. Are you not? Okay, ulti or not doesn't really matter. Whereas Twitch R being up versus not, right? So much of Twitch's power budget is in the ultimate. Twitch R being up versus down is a variance driver. Even if it's Twitch in the game one time versus next time, even in the same game, R being up from cooldown or not is, wow, the fight's going to play out very, very differently because he does or doesn't have spray and pray. It's actually why I like ultimates being a relatively high power level and a relatively high cooldown, because then you have a variance driver of is R up or is R not up. And it is one of the unfortunate things of how much ability haste is in, I think, too many item systems, is that too many champions have their ult up for every single team fight. Whereas it's not a strong, now again, in some places I think the amount of ability haste is actually completely appropriate, but in some places I think it has gone a little bit high, and I would like us to kind of bring that down to some degree, because I would like the variance driver of ult is up versus ult is not up. I think it's actually very, very valuable. Another way to drive variance is not just cooldown, not just champion state. Are they here? Is it a different champion or whatever? Are they across the map, right? Like having competing objectives, having a Baron here, a Dragon here, a Rift Scuttler here, a red buff there, a turret there, a minion wave there, right? Your fights are different because people are in different spaces. That's also useful. Vision, right? Another variance driver, great, right? Imperfect information, really, really good at that. But another thing is that Twitch's R doesn't always land. And this is, ends up being a very, very contentious thing, because variance is nice, but your champion not being reliable and you having no control over it is the hard thing. Like, hey, Lee Sin is a relatively high variance champion because how good you are at ward hopping and kicking and whatever else and landing Qs and the mind games around skill shots, that's all valuable. Landing Xerath Q or Karthus Q or Cassiopeia Q, this is a skill test between you and me. It's a variance driver. If we're playing Valorant and, do I get the headshot? Do you dodge my shot? What's going on? What's the utility setup? Like, variance driver, even if the guns are a little bit random, it's a lot of it's player skill. And so, abilities being unreliable because people can dodge them or because to aim them, a pretty reasonable variance driver that everyone accepts, right? Like, anyone can dodge or flash or spell shield a Yasuo Q3. All this stuff's available. I mean, you can flash, you can spell shield, whatever. Malphite ultimate, and that item, that like skill's like really like reliable, but still can be dodged around. The sort of difficulty with Twitch R is like, I think too many champions can generically, without trying, dodge Twitch ultimate, and it makes the ult feel bad when it's meant to be a heightened state. And I've seen the pitch online. We actually had discussed this internally as well, but it's not available at the scope of like, what if we made Twitch R something like Gwen R, or for the old heads out there, old Aurelia R, where it's kind of like Jhin as well, to be fair, but it's like, yeah, I actually just aim shots out here, and my cooldown is based on my attack speed, and I get n number of seconds to shoot shots out, and actually, I'm just going to go into a form where, and to be fair, this now shortcuts all of the concerns around like, oh, if it's unreliable, why is my ult betraying me? There might be a very good reason to make this change, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen in 0.20, but like, you know, there is a world where this is worth exploring, to be clear, because now it feels like fair variance driving. But a world where all you can do is right-click the Misfortune, and she's running in a circle with Yomu's active, you have absolutely no control except waiting for your ult to time out before you can do anything. And I think that is the part that feels kind of below the bar for variance that feels acceptable for the person driving the champion. And so it's why I went for this thing. The funny thing is, like, I mean, the Reddit post is like, why they're upping Twitch R, and here's the clip. But it's like, yeah, I think the extreme unreliability of your champion's strongest point in time, and the version of the reliability kind of feels unfair is a thing here. One other sort of comment I saw was, hey, why not make it like Xayah, where you're guaranteed to hit your primary target? We did discuss this as well. I brought it to the table. I was like, hey, how do we feel about this? And having some level of unreliability, saying that, yeah, if they're under Powerball, yeah, Rammus Q can outrun your ultimate. Okay, that seems fair. Or at least more fair, more reasonable. Yeah, LeBlanc W used her dashes, or like someone flashed or whatever. Like, they expended some meaningful high mobility cooldown, and this is how they got around the spell. Okay, that I buy. That to me feels pretty fair. That to me feels reasonable. This feels like the kind of shape I think you're allowed to have. But like, oh, I just ran sideways, would like to shortcut that overall. All right, I spent 80 minutes on it. Patch 3090 preview, went on my random tangents. Hopefully it was useful. Leave me some comments down below. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.